welcome to episode 18 of the MMA Rundown. That is Khabib's old walkout song called Dagestan. A lot of stuff to talk about this week. A lot of it centered around UFC 242. So first thing we'll talk about is Khabib getting the win over Dustin Poirier. Khabib and what's next for him. Likely that's going to be Tony Ferguson. The rest of the card, there are a lot of other interesting fights to talk about, so I'll recap UFC 242. Talk about some controversy that's been surrounding Khabib around the week, and then also some positive stuff that he's done, so sort of the yin and yang of that. Then from there we have Nate Diaz and Jorge Masvidal. They are set to fight at UFC 244 at Madison Square Garden. We have Colby Covington and Kamaru Usman still not being booked for their title fight, so what's going on there? Donald Cowboy Cerrone and Justin Gaethje will be fighting this coming week, so previewing that card. BJ Penn has been removed from his fight, and though the terms are fairly vague by Dana White, it sounds as though he may not be fighting in the UFC ever again, so we'll talk about that. Cris Cyborg signing a big deal with Bellator. They call it the biggest deal, but they don't really specify what makes it the biggest deal. We've got a recap of Bellator 226, which had a bit of an anticlimactic main event, and then the final thing I'll talk about on this episode is the USA Wrestling World Team finally getting settled in at 65 kilograms with Yianni, Jock Mahalis, and Zain Retherford finally having the wrestle off, and Zain getting the win there. So to start off with Khabib and Dustin Poirier, I did a video talking about a lot of the stuff I'm going to go over now, but might as well recap it. And like in that video, I started off by saying, look, with Khabib, he does all of the same stuff in every fight. So oftentimes what's more interesting is seeing how other fighters are going to try to deal with it and what they do. So what was interesting to me was to see how Dustin Poirier would try to deal with Khabib in the event of him getting taken down, what he would do to stop it, what sort of defenses he would use against the takedowns, and then how that actually worked out for him. It was pretty clear from the start that his plan was if he gets taken down, that he's not going to try to fight Khabib off his back. He's not going to try to sweep Khabib. He's not going to try to submit Khabib. He's just going to try to get back up, and he's going to try to get back up in a way that is fairly common with folk-style wrestling, where you kind of build to all fours, try to get back to standing, strip the grip, and then free yourself up. And from the first round all the way through to the final round, which was the third, that's how Dustin Poirier tried to deal with Khabib's top pressure. One of the things that I noted before this fight, and it's still worth mentioning after, especially with Tony Ferguson likely being the next opponent, is that Khabib oftentimes will get into finishing positions early in fights and not finish. He did it a lot with Al Quinta, where he would get mount or get his back and not be able to finish early on. He did it with Michael Johnson before he eventually got the finish. And in this fight as well, he had the back of Dustin Poirier early on and wasn't able to finish. And I guess if you're under the assumption that Khabib, oftentimes, even if he does get your back, you're not dead in the water like a guy like Damian Maia you'd be dead in the water with, then maybe that's a risk worth taking. It's also worth noting that the strategy seemed to prevent a lot of damage on the ground. I think Khabib only landed 11 ground strikes over the course of the fight, landed 54 total strikes throughout all three rounds. So by Dustin making it into a folk-style wrestling match every time it hit the mat, it kept him from getting pounded on quite as much as a lot of other opponents of Khabib. So those were the positives to that strategy. The negative, obviously, though, is that if you are giving up your back a lot, you're finding yourself in a bit of a risky spot, and eventually you can get caught there. And ultimately, in the third round, after the guillotine failed, it seems as though that's what happened. As far as Dustin's bright spots, in the second round, he landed what appeared to be a really strong overhand right and started chasing after him. I don't know that he landed a whole lot of clean shots after that. Khabib was definitely backing up and sort of running backwards and trying to get his wits about him, but it didn't look as though he was ever close to getting finished. It was just more like, oh, Dustin's got a bright spot here. Let's see what he can do with it. And Khabib was doing a good enough job to get his wits back about him without taking any additional damage. And then in the third round, that guillotine was very close. Dustin, his opinion on what happened there is that he felt as though instead of going shin and then leg over the top, that he should have just gone full closed guard from there. If that's how Dustin likes to finish his guillotines, that's definitely an acceptable way to finish it. Personally, I like finishing my guillotines the way that Dustin was doing it, where you have the knee across the shin and then also having the other leg over the top. Because if someone does roll over, then I can just come up and mount, and depending on my grip, I can either finish it with a one-arm guillotine from there. If I still have my grip, I can finish a two-arm guillotine from there. But if I don't finish, then I end up in top and mount, which is a very good place to be, whether it's jiu-jitsu or especially in MMA, where you can rain down elbows. And what happened that I feel like was a mistake for Dustin is that when Dustin got Khabib to roll to defend, Dustin didn't follow him up. And it looks as though had he followed Khabib up, Dustin likely would have been able to get top and mount on Khabib. From there, who knows what Dustin's able to do from it. Maybe Khabib's able to shrimp out really quickly, then get in on a single leg and come up on top. But still, it would have been cool to see Dustin try to finish from top there. I don't know that he gets the finish from there. It looked like he was getting kind of loose at the time that it was rolling, so he probably doesn't finish the guillotine from top and mount. but he still could have used it to sweep Khabib and get on top of Mount, and it would have been interesting to see what happened from there. From there, what a lot of people are saying online is that Dustin just quit after he missed that guillotine, and then he just gave up the choke. I didn't see it that way at all. It's definitely common in MMA for a fighter to give his opponent an easy choke just as a way out, and then that way he can say, oh, well, I didn't give up. He just caught a good choke, and I had to tap because he had the choke in. That's not what I saw with Dustin. It didn't look like Dustin gave up the choke. It was good hand fighting from Khabib from the back. Sunk in the choke really quick, had it deep, and Khabib's got a great squeeze, so he's able to finish it from there. So the idea of Dustin Poirier quitting on this fight, I think, is a ridiculous idea. I know some people, like Ben Askren, were trying to push that idea out there, but I don't buy that for a second. I think Dustin was willing to fight as long as he possibly could there, and just happened to get caught. And when you're caught in a deep choke, there's just no sense in not tapping out if you're just not getting out, because you end up in the situation where one of two things happens. Either you don't tap out, you go unconscious and you lose, or you tap out, you don't go unconscious and you lose. And in both cases, you lose. The difference is that in one case, you go unconscious and there are negative health effects to that. The other case, you don't go unconscious, but you're losing either way. So I feel like in this case, Dustin did what he did his best out there. He didn't quit on the fight. Sure, you want to get the win. You kind of feel regret in that way. You feel like you almost got the guillotine, so you feel regret in that way. But I don't feel like an effort type of thing. It's one where he should feel regret. I think he really did give it his best out there and kept trying until the very end when he really couldn't do anything to get out of that choke. So definitely don't hold that against him. For Khabib, very impressive. Leads us into the next point, though, which is the next fight for Khabib, which is likely to be Tony Ferguson. Now, Dana White was saying if Tony doesn't want it on the timeline that worked for Khabib, that he would look at Conor McGregor. I hate the idea of putting Conor versus Khabib in there right now. I think Conor should be fighting someone else. I think with the main event for UFC 244 now being a non-title fight, you have now set a precedent that you don't need a title fight to be a main event. One of Conor's biggest hangups for a lot of his fights and a lot of his negotiations is that he wants to be a main event. That's part of the reason why they end up forcing Conor into these title fights. I think now that you have this precedent for a non-title fight main event with Masvidal versus Diaz, you can put Conor in a different non-title fight main event, maybe the winner of Cowboy versus Gaethje. And then in that way, you're not messing up the top of the lightweight title picture. You can get Khabib versus Tony finally. And then from there, we can get the fight everyone wants to see. And like I mentioned before, when Khabib gets dominant positions early, like mount, like top crucifix, like the back, he doesn't always finish. And sometimes he tends to get a little bit tired afterwards. So with a guy like Tony, Tony's a guy who you never really see him tired. He's a guy who's tough to take down. It takes a lot of energy to get him down. And if you don't finish him early, he's going to keep coming. So to me, this still shows that Khabib does have that opening where even if he gets you in a dominant position early, he's not always going to be able to finish. He can wear down a little bit over the course of a fight. And from there, I mean, while I don't know that I would pick Tony over Khabib, it's definitely safe to say that Tony presents some challenges that work against some of Khabib's weaknesses. And for that reason, I really hope that's the fight they make next. I have no interest in the Conor rematch. Tony versus Khabib is the fight I want to see right now. I don't know how these negotiations are going to go. It's kind of annoying with the UFC how a lot of times these negotiations seem to drag on a little bit longer than they should. How a lot of times you have these guys who are under multi-fight contracts who agreed to fight X amount of times, but then every time they want to fight again, it's always a new renegotiation. I mean, I get why they're doing it. You got to do what's best for you, but sometimes as a fan, that's a little bit annoying. And obviously, with the Kamaru versus Colby fight getting pushed back, that's another example of these renegotiations going wrong. So hopefully that doesn't bring any issues. Hopefully Tony versus Khabib is a fight that's made, and we really get a really fascinating matchup there. On to the next topic, we have. What do we have? We have the controversy with Khabib and then the positive aspects of Khabib. So, look, here's the thing that I see a lot of, and it's not just an MMA thing, I think it's an everything thing. People want to identify someone either as a good person or a bad person, and if you identify them as a bad person, then you just have to dislike them. If you identify them as a good person, you have to like them. And Khabib is in the spot where there are aspects of him that are very negative that people like to focus in on, but there are also aspects of him that are very positive. On the negative end, there was a lot of focus around this fight from certain MMA media members around his relationship with Ramzan Kadyrov, who is the Chechen dictator, also talking about how he feels about women in MMA or about homosexuals, given that he's fairly religious and Islamic. And to me, as far as those last two aspects go, as far as what he thinks about women fighting or what he thinks about homosexuals, to me, there's a big difference between your personal thoughts on something and what you bring into action. So if you say you want for a gay marriage, but you're kind to any gay person you meet. You treat them with respect and you treat them like a decent person. To me, that's not that bothersome. Whereas if you have an issue with it, and then when you see someone like that in person, and you treat them like a lesser person, that's where it becomes an issue. I think at this point, it's a safe assumption that Khabib probably isn't a fan of gay marriage. He probably isn't a fan of women fighting MMA. But I don't know that any of his actions seem to really go against anything like that. So to me, I really wouldn't hold that against him. The thing with Kadyrov is I don't know enough about Chechnya or Dagestan or anything else around that region to understand what's right and what's wrong on that. A lot of media reports tend to talk about how Kadyrov is very, very rough on his people, specifically rough on homosexuals. The media who writes these stories tend to write a lot of false stories surrounding America, so if they can't get American stories right, I don't know that I can trust them to get stories right that are halfway across the world. But at this point, if we're going to assume what they're saying is true, I mean, if that's the guy who's in charge in your region, what are we expecting Khabib to do here? Just like push him off to the side and like just not associate with him, even though that's where he's from and that's his homeland and that's where all of his family is. Like I don't. I feel like I don't know enough about that situation to know whether or not I should be faulting Khabib for his relationship with Kadyrov. The other aspect that would be looked at, though, is the positives of Khabib Nurmagomedov. So while you have those negatives surrounding him, one of the very cool things that we saw after this fight is that after he won the fight, he took Dustin Poirier's shirt and they swapped shirts. And on the mic, he said, "Oh, by the way, guys, Dustin's got a big charity. What we're going to do here is we're going to sell the shirt that I'm wearing right now, and all the proceeds are going to go to Dustin's charity." And in seeing that, Dana White decided he was going to match it too. So as far as the negative aspects of Khabib and what he does as a person, it seems as though he has some beliefs that aren't exactly in line with, I'd say, most of America, at least at this point in the world. There are some other aspects of him that are fairly problematic too. I think there's a bit of a feeling that he acts as a bit of a gangster, isn't exactly the most hospitable person, at least in America. I have a training partner who was working with someone who was fighting one of Khabib's cousins, and in the lead up to that fight, they made a video beforehand where they're just like, if you remember how Conor before the Mayweather fight was like, "Fuck the Mayweathers." They made a little video where before the guy was fighting one of Khabib's guys, he's like, "Fuck the Nurmagomedovs," and the Khabib's guy ended up winning that fight. But after that fight, not only did they track down the guy who he fought, but they also tracked down my training partner and jumped him backstage. I think it was at a PFL event, with the whole issue being, hey, you can't talk about us like that on TV. And this is them on work visas in America attacking an American citizen over basically a little mini pre-fight hype video. So that kind of stuff I don't really like. And part of the story from what he was saying is that Khabib was actually like on a video chat with them while they were doing it, and they're like, hey, we got him right here, and then that's what happened. So as far as that story goes, it's a bit of hearsay because this is me telling it secondhand from my training partner from what he told me. But either way, you look at those sort of aspects, and those are definitely negative aspects of Khabib. But on the charitable side, you look at what he's doing with Dustin's foundation. You look at what he is planning to do, what he's saying about fighting GSP, and then having all the proceeds go to help get clean water in Africa. There are definitely positive aspects of Khabib too. So I think if you're looking at him on a balance out the negative and the positive, it seems as though, at least recently, he's doing enough to balance it out in the positive direction. But I can see why people, if they focus on one way or the other, they can form a strong opinion. But to me, Khabib's not in a position where I feel a strong way either way, where I feel like he's a great guy or that I feel like he's a scumbag. I think he, like most people, does good things and does bad things. And I'm hoping that the good outweighs the bad. And it seems like some of the stuff he's doing recently is definitely doing a strong amount to make the good side heavier. So that's good for him. From there, we look at the rest of the card. The co-main event was between Edson Barboza and Paul Felder. This was a fight where I was just kind of like yelling the whole time I was watching it. I wasn't really like paying attention close enough to score it. I thought Barboza had done enough to just edge it out, but it wasn't like to the point where if Felder won 29-28, I'd be really upset about it. Felder winning 30-27 on one of the scorecards was ridiculous. A lot of people online seem to think that Barboza won that fight. I tend to agree, but I don't have a really strong opinion on it. But either way, it was a very good fight. The two guys are split 1-1 now, so it seems as though a rematch would make sense. I don't know that either of them have any desire to get back in there again because they definitely get hurt quite a bit when they're doing those fights. But definitely an interesting fight to watch. Amazed me how hard Barboza was throwing kicks, especially with Felder doing a good job of getting his elbow in and oftentimes forcing those kicks off the elbow, which when you're throwing a kick and you hit someone's elbow, it is excruciatingly painful. But Barboza kept throwing them, so that was impressive. Good job by Felder dealing with a lot of the kicks. He still took a lot of really hard ones, though. Did a decent job in boxing range. Both guys landed shots that looked like they would knock out a lot of other fighters, and for it not to knock each other out, especially in the heat that they were in, that says a lot about both of them in a positive light. In the fight before that, it was a fight that I was extremely interested in seeing, which is Islam Makhachev versus Dobby. In Makhachev, you have a combat sambo world champion. In Hamosh, you have an ADCC world champion, which is submission grappling, but it's effectively a jiu-jitsu tournament. So he's effectively a jiu-jitsu world champion in Nogi. Unfortunately, we didn't get a whole lot of grappling in this fight. First 2 rounds, it was mostly a stand-up fight. Islam looked pretty good. I think Islam's been in MMA longer than Dobby Hamosh, so you have a stand-up fight between a guy who's been working stand-up a little bit longer than the other guy, and the guy who has more stand-up experience. In this case, Islam was definitely getting the better of those exchanges. In the 3rd round, Islam lands a huge knee from a Muay Thai clinch, drops Dobby Hamosh, and then we actually do get some groundwork, but from there it was up against the fence. Hamosh made some decent attempts at arm bars, but was kind of getting stuffed up against the fence. Makhachev was keeping his posture really low, not attempting to pass, not really attempting to do a whole lot offensively, just trying to throw enough punches where the ref doesn't pull him off, but also not do much in terms of improving position. So didn't really get to see all the grappling exchanges I wanted to see out of that, but it was still an interesting fight. I think in hindsight, you could say maybe it was a bit of a boring fight, but because there was so much between the two in terms of skill, it was one of those fights where when you're watching it, you're like, at any second now, something cool is going to happen. So I still felt entertained while I was watching it. The fight before that, we had Curtis Blades versus Jameel Abdurraheem. Blades just absolutely dominated this fight, got an early takedown, landed a bunch of heavy elbows from top there. Looked like he was getting close towards the end of the 1st round to finishing from mount. Gets him down again in the 2nd round, lands a giant elbow, breaks Abdurraheem's nose, and then Abdurraheem kind of like turtled up once he realized his nose was broken in half, and that's when the fight was stopped. In the fight before that, we had Maribek Taisumov versus Diego Ferreira. I really thought Maribek Taisumov was going to win this fight. I had been expecting to do a pretty long video on Maribek Taisumov because he was a guy who interested me a lot. I think I still want to talk about some of the points I was going to make regardless, even though he did lose this fight. He won the 1st round, but then the next 2 rounds, Diego Ferreira just dominated from there. You'd wonder if they were fighting in a normal 70-degree air-conditioned arena, if this fight goes any differently, because Taisumov looked pretty good until he started to gas out and his feet weren't really moving around as much. But either way, you can't take that away from Diego. Diego was fighting in the same exact arena in the same exact climate, so I don't know that's a fair excuse to say that Maribek got gassed while his opponent's dealing with the same stuff, but that's kind of what happened. But some of the points I was going to bring up about Maribek Taisumov is that this is a guy who couldn't get a U.S. visa and still can't get a U.S. visa, and with the UFC being a U.S.-based company, it's really tough to get opportunities if you can't get a U.S. visa. It's tough enough even when you can, just because that costs extra money. You think about how much fighters make on the bottom end of the card, usually looking around 10 and 10. If you throw on a visa on top of that, that definitely makes up a pretty big percentage of what their pay would be or what the UFC is going to pay to bring them in, especially when you factor in the travel expenses as well for the coaches and everyone else. So as a result, a lot of times the guys who get the opportunities in the UFC and then the guys who get the opportunities to get on some of the bigger cards, oftentimes which are held in Vegas, tend to be guys who have U.S. citizenship. And Taisumov was one of those guys where I was under the impression heading into this fight, and again, he's had some injury issues and we haven't seen him in a while, but I was under the impression that this is a guy who is likely a top 5 lightweight right now, but hasn't had the chance to prove it yet. With this fight, it's kind of hard to make that claim, given that he lost to Ferreira, who has some other losses to some guys who were towards the top of the division. But Taisumov was a guy who was just starching everyone on the feet, had a bunch of knockouts in a row. I think he had 5 straight knockouts in the UFC. Excellent Muay Thai. Very good grappler, more of like a wrestling style than anything, but still a very good grappler. A guy who'd be very tough to deal with because he's going to beat most guys on the feet, and he's going to be very difficult to take down and control. But in this case, he really didn't get to showcase himself quite as much. But I guess there is maybe I'll have to do this in a separate podcast or in a separate video, but there definitely is something to talk about here in terms of fighters not getting opportunities outside of the country because of those costs. And maybe when you think about the fact that there are so many American wrestlers who are champions, you wonder when, in reality, in the Wrestling World Championships, it's usually Russia and then sometimes Iran ahead of America. Why not only is wrestling so dominant right now in the UFC, but particularly wrestlers from America, and wondering how much of that has to do with folk style just being more conducive to MMA than freestyle is, and how much of it has to do with just opportunities being easier for American fighters in an American company. But towards the prelims, we're looking at Joanne Calderwood getting a split decision win over Andrea Lee. I was very lucky in terms of how this fight card worked out, in that I actually talked about this in a Khabib video I did a couple weeks ago. I was supposed to miss this card because I had made a really stupid mistake in booking myself for a jiu-jitsu tournament that was going on during this card. I didn't realize that it was in Abu Dhabi until it was too late. So while I'm used to the cards being on late in the night after a tournament would be over, this one actually was going on during the tournament. I was lucky that the tournament was running ahead, and I was actually able to compete and win my gi division, take third in no gi, and get out of there pretty quick. So this particular fight, I got in just towards the end of it, so I didn't get to see the full fight, so I'm not sure whether or not the split decision was correct. I don't know that I saw a whole lot of people online saying that it was incorrect, so I guess I'll take their word for it. But either way, Joanne Calderwood and getting the win over Andrea Lee beat someone who was on quite a streak. Lee looked like she was getting pretty close to earning a title shot. With the win, Calderwood seems like she's getting pretty close to a title shot herself. Then we have Zubaira Tukhugov, and again, I think it's worth mentioning that the rest of the fights I'm going to talk about, I'm just going off of what I've seen in highlights and what I read about. Like I said, I didn't actually get to see these fights live because I was competing in jiu-jitsu. But Zuba fought to a draw with Leroy Murphy. Sounds as though one of the rounds was scored as a 10-8. Had it not been, I think Murphy would have been the one who had gotten the decision. But I think the first round was a 10-8 for Zubas on one of the judges' scorecards, and that's why it ended up going to a draw. Then Sarah Morris got a KO against Liana Jojuja. Then we had Otto Azaitar knocking out Teemu Packalén with a punch that kind of clipped him behind the ear and just sent him stiff as a board, face first into the canvas. Pretty rough looking knockout, but big win for Azaitar, who's now 12-0. Then on the early prelims, we had Bilal Muhammad getting a rear naked choke on Takashi Sato. We had Muslim Salikov knocking out Nordin Taleb. This was another vicious knockout. Bit of an unnecessary punch afterwards, but I guess since you wait until the ref pulls you off, you kind of have to keep going. Hate to see it go that way, but that's what happened. We had Omari Akhmedov get a unanimous decision over Zach Cummings, and then Don Madge get a unanimous decision over Faraz Ziam. From there, I was mentioning this a little bit before, but we have a new main event for UFC 244. I think everyone expected the main event of this card to be Colby Covington and Kamaru Usman. Negotiations for that were in play for it to be in the main event. It didn't go through. I've been hearing things in both directions from what Joe Rogan said on the Fight Companion podcast while he was a little bit intoxicated, which sometimes can work as truth serum. It sounds as though the issue at play here was Colby Covington's side, not Kamaru Usman's side, although I think both sides had their own separate issues. It seemed as though at one point Masvidal versus Usman was being discussed as a possible main event there, so it does seem as though Colby was probably the issue. And the issue was that Colby wanted more money than what was being offered to him, which is weird to me. I don't know what his expectations were relative to his last fight with Robbie Lawler. Again, his last fight with Robbie Lawler was a midday ESPN fight, whereas this would be a primetime pay-per-view fight. So I don't know how they would be able to pay him enough to fight on ESPN, but wouldn't be able to offer enough for him to fight on a pay-per-view headliner. So not sure where his demands changed between the two fights, whether the UFC didn't feel like they were willing to budge on that, how far off they were in negotiations, but it seems as though things fell out of play and they felt like they needed a main event quicker and weren't willing to work with Colby on that. So in the end, we get the main event for the bad motherfucker title between Nate Diaz and Jorge Masvidal. As far as who I think is going to win here, I honestly have no idea. It's a tough one to call. For Masvidal, he's had a lot of issues in the UFC with decisions. It seems as though every time it goes to a decision, even if it looks like he wins, he tends to lose a split decision. I don't know that he's going to be able to get Nate Diaz out of there, so it seems like it's reasonable to think this would go to a decision. Will Nate Diaz take a huge shot, which he seems to be doing a lot in his fights? He got dropped a handful of times by Conor McGregor. Anthony Pettis landed a bunch of big shots on him. It would stand to reason that Jorge Masvidal is going to get some good shots in himself. Is Nate Diaz going to be able to eat those and just keep pressing forward and keep his pressure up and be able to outland Masvidal in volume? Possibly. I think that's a reasonable expectation, but to me, I can definitely see Masvidal getting the knockout here. I can see him landing huge on Nate Diaz and putting him away, but I can also see Nate Diaz eating some heavy shots, keeping a heavy volume going, and being able to win a decision here as well. So either way, definitely going to be interesting to fight to watch. Going to be a fun fight to watch, and can't wait to see it in a couple months from now. And then going back to the Colby and Usman thing we were talking about, that fight still isn't booked, but at least on the positive side, that's the fight I want to see, and it seems like that's still what they're pushing for. At this point, it just seems like the negotiations are just delaying the date that they're going to get it. So hopefully this is something that still happens this year. Like I mentioned before, it seems like Colby wants a little bit more money than what he's being offered right now. It's annoying. Like, as a fan, I like seeing when guys who have contracts honor those contracts. Now, granted, you can make arguments both ways that if I, as a fighter, sign for 5 fights for $1 million, 200,000 apiece, and I realize I'm worth a lot more, is it wrong for me to say midway through the contract, hey, if I'm gonna finish this out here, you got to pay me more? I don't know. The other way is that if the UFC signs someone like that and they aren't worth what they're getting paid, the UFC doesn't necessarily feel bashful about releasing those fighters and not paying out the full terms because they don't fight out through the full terms. But still, as a fan, it's kind of annoying when you have obvious matchups and the UFC just can't come to terms with guys who they already have under terms because they're constantly renegotiating. So hopefully this gets figured out. They find a good deal to make here, and the fight between Colby and Usman actually comes through, and we get that fight. Next thing to talk about would be the upcoming card this week. The main event is between Cowboy and Justin Gaethje. Gaethje is a guy where if he gets a dominant win here, especially if you look at the timing of it, he could definitely work his way into the title picture. I don't think he should be jumping ahead of Tony Ferguson, but that little situation that Dana was talking about, where maybe Tony doesn't accept the fight, and I think what he was referring to there is that the reason why Dustin Poirier even got this fight with Khabib is because he was like an alternate for that Max Holloway interim title fight. It was supposed to be Max Holloway versus Tony Ferguson. Ferguson didn't accept the interim title fight, which is a little bit surprising. I'm not sure what exactly was going on at the time. I know there were those personal issues he had, but I don't know if he was still working through that or if he had just finished it up around that time. But either way, it was him not accepting that fight that led to Dustin Poirier being put in that fight instead. Poirier wins the fight and then gets the fight with Khabib. So maybe that's what Dana's talking about here, and that he's saying, hey, maybe there's still an issue with Tony, in which case then you'll have to find someone else. With the dominant performance here from Justin Gaethje, he could potentially be that other person. As far as how I think he matches up with Cowboy, this is a very interesting fight to me. Like I mentioned before, Cowboy tends to have the biggest trouble with guys who are very good boxers. Gaethje can box, but he's not exactly the most technical guy, and Gaethje kind of has that same problem. When you look at that fight that he had against Eddie Alvarez, Alvarez boxed him up, was able to take advantage of Gaethje constantly keeping his hands up and was able to land to the body. Gaethje likes to walk forward with a high shell, and Alvarez did a good job of making him pay for it. So to me, both of these guys have some openings in the boxing. I don't know that either of them is going to just be completely dominant over the other one there. And then from the kicks, Gaethje's got very good leg kicks, although Cowboy's very good at checking kicks as well, whereas Cowboy's better at coming up to the body and then also going up to the head. So to me, this is a very competitive fight. I'd probably give the edge to Cerrone here, but it can definitely go either way. Both these guys throw heat. It's probably a safe assumption that both of these guys are going to take some serious shots. They're both going to land some serious shots, so who's able to land a big enough one to put the other guy down, I don't know. This is going 5 rounds. Will it last all 5 rounds? That's another good question here. Don't imagine grappling is going to play a big role here. Cowboy has tried to take down other opponents. Is he going to try to take down Gaethje? He may do it just to try to give Gaethje something else to worry about on the feet, but I don't know that we're going to get any prolonged grappling exchanges here. Then when looking at the rest of the card, we have Glover Teixeira and Nikita Krylov. Krylov's finally back in the UFC, working his way up the light heavyweight division again. Glover, still a very good grappler. He seems a little slow on the feet. Not that he was ever like incredibly fast on the feet, but it seems as though he's slowing down a bit there. So you'd figure that Krylov would have the advantage there, but if Glover is able to take him down, Glover should be able to smash from there, and if he isn't able to get the finish, at least be able to dominate some rounds. This is a 3-round fight, so as long as you win 2 rounds and survive the third, you're going to do enough to win. So I think Glover probably gets the win here, but Nikita's definitely going to give him some issues on the feet, so we'll see what Glover's able to do to deal with the speed disadvantage he's going to have there. Then we have Todd Duffee, who I feel like it's been forever since I've seen him fight, versus Jeff Hughes. Not sure who to pick on that one. We have Michel Pereira, who's one of the more odd yet exciting fighters. Can't wait to watch him. He had that awesome knockout in his last fight. Also known for trying to like jump off fences and do some other crazy stuff that you don't see in pro wrestling. So can't wait to see what he's going to do here against Sergey Kendosco. We have Shoeface Antonio Carlos Jr. versus Uriah Hall. Really good striker versus grappler match, with Shoeface being the grappler and Uriah Hall being the striker. You figure as long as it stays on the feet, Uriah Hall's going to have a big advantage. How tentative is Uriah Hall going to be, though, with Shoeface being as good as he is on the ground? Is he going to go after him and try those spinning kicks where if he misses, he risks getting taken down? That we'll have to see, but never have an issue with watching a striker versus grappler match because you figure wherever the fight ends up taking place, if it's on the feet, one guy's going to be able to do some really cool stuff, and if it's on the ground, the other guy's going to be able to do some really cool stuff. And then we have Misha Cirkunov versus Jimmy Crute. Cirkunov is one of those guys who, from a skill standpoint, is definitely a top 10, almost even possibly top 5 light heavyweight, but it seems as though he has some issues with his chin and doesn't always seem to compete up to his abilities. Jimmy Crute is a 10-0 Australian who, on the other hand, seems to be very good at competing up to his abilities. So it seems pretty likely that Crute will be able to get the knockout here, just based off what we've seen from Cirkunov in the past. But Cirkunov's a legit black belt. He's got decent striking. It's not out of the realm of possibility that he's able to win this fight here and just be the better technical fighter, because I think he is the better overall fighter, but it's just what kind of Cirkunov shows up on fight night and how's he able to take shots, because it's tough not to take a few shots over the course of a fight, and if you're having trouble with that, it's going to be tough to get some wins against some of the best guys in the division. On the prelims, we have Marcin Tybura versus Augusto Sakai. We have Cole Smith versus Miles Johns. Andrew Sanchez versus Marvin Vettori, which is a really interesting fight. I think Vettori is one of the more underrated guys in the middleweight division. Fought a very close fight with Stylebender. Some people even thought he beat Stylebender. I think even the final score was like 2-1 in rounds though for Stylebender. So he's definitely up there with some of the better guys when he gets the opportunity to fight them. So we'll see how he handles Andrew Sanchez, who's a very good grappler. Then we have Brad Katona versus Hunter Azure. Jordan Griffin versus Chad Skelly, Louis Smolka versus Ryan McDonald, and Kyle Prepolek versus Austin Hubbard. Other news to talk about, BJ Penn got into those street fights. I talked about it last week, and Dana White was asked about it in the pre-fight press conferences, or in the pre-fight scrums leading up to UFC 242, and he said, look, this is it, BJ's done. We just can't have this right now. He needs to get help. Never said he was releasing him from his contract. If he is under contract, then he technically is required to offer him fights. So what this actually means from a contract standpoint, whether he's going to still offer him fights, but just maybe like offer him fights that he's sure that BJ won't take, I don't know what the plan is there. But like I mentioned last week, it's very clear that BJ's way of fixing himself right now is going to rehab. It's not just continuing to fight and hoping that keeps him distracted from doing other things that are really bad for his health. So we'll see what happens from here. I really do hope that BJ gets help, and whether or not he ends up getting sober and then fighting again, or whether he just decides he's done fighting and gets sober anyway and still makes his life better. I think either way, it's just important that he finds some sobriety right now and really gets everything reset and just gets on the right track. As far as Bellator news, we have Cris Cyborg going over to Bellator. What they said, and by they I mean Scott Coker, is that this is the biggest contract for a women's fighter. Ronda Rousey was a women's fighter, so that would mean that this contract is bigger than Ronda Rousey. The term that they used was bigger. So what does bigger mean? Does bigger mean bigger as in largest amount of years, largest amount of money, largest amount of guaranteed money? You'd figure that with the pay-per-view bonuses and the pay-per-view points that Ronda Rousey had, that it'd be pretty tough for Bellator to pay Cyborg Ronda Rousey money, and if they do that, they're going to be losing a significant amount of money, and it's going to be a terrible move for business. So it's not exactly clear what biggest contract means for them, but it seems as though, at least on Scott Coker's side, he feels like he made a good investment. On Cyborg's side, she feels like she got a great deal. On the side of anyone who wants to argue that the UFC is this monopoly that all the top fighters have to deal with because no one else is going to offer them good money, it seems like this seems to be another instance where that's not the case. But we'll have to wait and see. We'll see what the disclosed pay is when she finally does fight for Bellator. We'll see what kind of impact she has on the ratings, whether or not she's worth this giant amount of money that they say they're spending on her. Another part of her contract, though, is that she's also allowed to do boxing and do some other stuff. So that's good for her. It'll be interesting to see what she wants to do. I don't know that I'm really that interested in watching her box Clarissa Shields, although it sounds like that's something that she's interested in doing. I don't know if there's any interest on her end in terms of doing some high-level jiu-jitsu stuff, like competing with someone like Gabby Garcia, but hey, if she wants to do that, that'd be interesting. Although I think there are some current UFC fighters who still do professional jiu-jitsu matches. I know Dan Henderson and John Jones had a match at Submission Underground while both under UFC contract. So I don't know that the UFC does much to stop people from doing grappling matches so much as it is striking matches. But either way, seems as though Cyborg's happy, so I guess good for her in that way. As far as Bellator 226 goes, in the main event, you had Ryan Bader fighting a title fight at heavyweight versus Chet Congo. Congo was the challenger. Bader was dominating much of this fight. Then along the fence, Congo started wincing as though he got poked in the eye. watching the replays, I don't know where I see where the eye poke was. It may have just been a punch, but from what I saw, it didn't look like he actually got poked in the eye. As far as whether or not I would say that he was quitting or finding a way out, I mean, I think from where I'm sitting, it seems as though that's probably what happened, but I, it does look like there was something up with his eye. It's just what caused it. I don't know what sort of damage there is to the eye, so I would not make a definitive statement to say that Congo quit or anything. We don't exactly know what happened in the eye. For all we know, that there was like a detached retina or something. And if that's the case, then I don't know that what he did was unreasonable or even cowardly at all. So I think we just kind of need more information on what happened to that eye and to understand what he was feeling there for him to end up leaving that fight and for it to be a no contest. I think either way, I don't know that making a rematch of Congo and Bader makes a whole lot of sense here. There are other fights to make. I know Rampage was trying to work his way into it. I don't know that he's done anything competitively to earn a title shot, but I guess when you're Bellator and you're just looking to get some ratings here and there, maybe that's the fight you make. You could also move Bader back down to 205 and find some options for him there as well. As far as this talk of Bader being the heavyweight, the best heavyweight in the world right now, it's something that Scott Coker's talking about. I mean, I don't know that there's any one heavyweight who beats every other heavyweight out there. But with Anthony Johnson coming back to the UFC and with Johnson having a really dominant win over Bader back at light heavyweight, I don't know that today's Bader beats today's Rumble Johnson. So I can definitely think of at least one guy who beats Bader, who I'm sure beats Bader at heavyweight. So I don't know that he's the best heavyweight in the world, but he's still definitely one of the best guys out there, and it's good for Bellator to have him. They also started the featherweight Grand Prix. So we had Derek Campos and Daniel Strauss, which I don't actually believe this was a featherweight Grand Prix fight. I think it was a different fight, but it was still a really good fight for Derek Campos. Strauss did not look good at all. He was fighting off of his back for most of the fight. Ended up losing a unanimous decision, 30-26, 30-25, and 30-25. We had Adam Boric beating Pat Curran by TKO at the end of the second round. Lands a big flying knee. And then landing a bunch of ground and pound, although most of it was being blocked. Pat Curran wasn't doing anything to throw back. So while it's not as though he was taking a whole lot of additional damage after that flying knee dropped him, you kind of have to show that you're doing something offensive and something to stop getting punched, and that was really never the case with Curran. He was just covering up, and yes, he was blocking just about every punch, but you can't just sit there and block punches without throwing back, without expecting the fight to get stopped, and that's what ended up happening. We had Pedro Carvalho defeating Sam Cecilia with a submission in the second round. Officially, it goes as a face crank. I guess sometimes when you get a choke, that's sort of what you end up having to do there. We have Emmanuel Sanchez beating Taiwan Claxton by triangle choke, and Daniel Carey defeating Gaston Bolanos, one of the better strikers out there in Bellator, by guillotine choke. On the undercard, I don't know if there's a whole lot of fights worth talking about, but I'll just read through the results really quick. John Teixeira beat Ashley Grimshaw by TKO. Adam Piccolotti beat Jacob Smith by rear naked choke. Jessica Orga beat Amber Leibrook by armbar. Cass Bell defeated Isaiah Hocha by guillotine choke. Bustamberel Dagavordorj beat James Terry by submission with a bulldog choke. We had Renato Alves versus Abraham Vallecao. That was a rear naked choke for Renato. Hyder Emil defeated Ignacio Ortiz by split decision, and Christopher Gonzalez defeated Luis Vargas by unanimous decision. And the last thing to talk about is with USA Wrestling. So I had mentioned this last week that they were looking to finally finish up their roster, get that 65 kilogram spot figured out. There was a bit of an issue where they do best 2 out of 3 to determine the spot on the team. Zain Retherford won the first match. In the second match, Zain Retherford technically won that match, but he won that match after a review that was called way too late. Gave him some points that may or may not have properly been given to him. So upon further review, they decided to void that second match and have him go back and wrestle again. So what that would mean is that Yianni would have to win the next 2 matches to go 2-1 and therefore win the best of 3, whereas Zain would just have to win 1. They go out there and wrestle. Very good defensive match by both guys. Both guys had gotten in on some deep shots and were able to work their way out of it. Yianni scored first with 1 point after a failed review from Zain. Zain got 2 points on an exchange that Ben Askren and some other people in the wrestling community thought should have gone 2-2. I'm not versed well enough in freestyle wrestling rules to know whether or not that was the right call, but it seems as though some people who are very versed in it felt like they called it wrong, but Yanni's corner didn't feel like it was wrong. They didn't challenge it. So in the end, Zain wins 2-1. And in doing so, Zain Retherford gets a spot on the U.S. World Team. Yianni, even though he won a major tournament in Yatsurdogu, even though he has 2 wins over Zain this year, he's now technically 2-2 against Zain this year, although his 2 losses happen to come at the Final X, which is the World Team Best of 3 series. So even though he lost those matches, still had a decent record against Zain, beat the world number one, and beat the streets. But because wrestling only allows one person to go per year, he wasn't able to get it done here. He ends up losing. And so, unfortunately, Yianni Giacomo is going to have to watch some guys who he's already beaten compete for a world title this year. And hopefully Zain, who was good enough to beat Yianni, can sort of duplicate some of the success that Yanni's had. But we'll find that out in a few weeks. But that covers it for all the topics for this week's show. Just one side thing to note is that I did do a video on that Zain and Yianni thing and had a copyright strike from Flow Wrestling. Right now I'm trying to get in touch with Flow Wrestling to see if I can get that taken down. But one of the things with copyright strikes on YouTube is that when you get them, you sort of risk losing your channel. So I'm going to try to be careful and make sure that it doesn't happen again, especially not within the next 3 months. But if anything does happen, it would be best if you follow me on some other platforms. So for videos, all my videos that are up on YouTube also get put up on BitChute, so you can follow me on that site. For podcasts, a great way to follow along is to subscribe to my podcast. You can find that on Apple Podcasts. You can also find a bunch of other links on Anchor. So Anchor has links to Spotify, Google Podcasts, and a bunch of other ones like that. So I'd definitely say subscribe to the podcast, because even if my YouTube channel does have any issues where it gets held down or struck down, I'll still be posting content to those sites. And then you can also follow me on Twitter at _MMA_rundown. So that covers it for this week. Looking forward to next week. Looking forward to Cowboy versus Gaethje. It's going to be a hell of a main event and a pretty decent card, and that's going to be going on underneath it too. So can't wait.